Okay, so in this video we're going to pick up on the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is a large gland. It's basically entirely devoted to endocrine activity, so we call it the largest endocrine organ in the body. And it's located just inferior to the larynx on the anterior surface of the neck. The thyroid gland is kind of this butterfly-shaped gland, and it has two lobes. We have a right lobe and a left lobe, which are connected by in the midline by something called the isthmus. So the thyroid gland you can see here in this picture, here's the larynx, and just inferior to the larynx, which is your voice box, we have the thyroid gland. You can see it's kind of butterfly shaped. We have a right lobe, left lobe with a central isthmus. This is what the thyroid gland would look like on a cadaver, and it has kind of a purplish hue to it because the thyroid gland is full of iodine, because thyroid hormone is made using iodine. And like 99% of your body's iodine is actually locked up in the thyroid gland because most of your iodine needs are used up by your thyroid hormone. Now, you can see that the thyroid gland is a very vascular gland. It's full of blood vessels because it sends out a lot of hormone. And if we look at the microscopic structure of the thyroid gland, what we find is that there's these large fluid-filled cavities deep within the thyroid gland at the microscopic level. Now, we'll be looking at this in lab later underneath the microscopes, but what we find here is that this whole structure here is called the thyroid follicle. Okay? Now, the thyroid follicle is lined with something like a simple cuboidal epithelium with these follicular cells. So all of these are little follicular cells here, which make and secrete thyroid hormone. Now, these follicular cells surround a fluid-filled cavity right here, which is full of something called colloid. Now, colloid is a mixture of basically water and metals, and our kind of metal or ion here will be iodine. And what happens is that your iodine is actually stored in here with something called thyroglobulin. Okay, so thyroglobulin is actually what stores iodine in these thyroid follicles. That way you can actually go up to a year without any iodine in your diet. So let's say if you cut out all iodine from your diet, you can survive on the stored iodine in your thyroid gland for up to a year. That's if you had enough iodine already. And one of the reasons for this is iodine is kind of a rare element in nature. It's hard to find in edible foods, especially if you're living away from the ocean. So it's difficult to encounter iodine, but when you do, your body stores it really well in the thyroid gland, in these thyroid follicles, which are full of colloid, which are chock full of iodine. Now, these follicular cells are actually what make and secrete thyroid hormone, or TH. But we also have these parafollicular cells here, kind of off to the side, and these parafollicular cells would be between all of the follicles. So parafollicular cells would be in here and in here. And what these parafollicular cells secrete is something called calcitonin, which is involved with calcium homeostasis. And we'll talk about that coming up here in a little bit. So those thyroid follicles are lined with follicular cells, which are full of thyroglobulin inside of each of those little colloid compartments. Now, thyroglobulin is the precursor to thyroid hormone. So what happens is that our body can make thyroid hormone when it's needed from our stored thyroglobulin. And what happens is that the amount of thyroid hormone that's made and secreted depends on a feedback mechanism, which we'll talk about coming up next. So that feedback mechanism we see here is where the hypothalamus releases TRH, or thyroid releasing hormone. That stimulates the anterior pituitary to release TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Now, what thyroid hormone does is it actually has an effect on most cells within your body. So what this means is that most of your body's cells have a receptor for thyroid hormone. And what thyroid hormone does is actually binds to this receptor. And the cool thing is actually the receptor is found on your mitochondria. So when thyroid hormone binds to this receptor on your mitochondria, it actually changes the metabolic activity of your mitochondria and causes it to make ATP more quickly. So thyroid hormone regulates something called basal metabolic rate, which is the rate at which you can use nutrients and make ATP while your body's at rest. So if you have a sufficient amount of thyroid hormone in your bloodstream, then you'll have a normal basal metabolic rate. If you have low thyroid hormone levels, then you'll have a lower metabolism. So you'll be more cold because you're not generating as much body heat. And you'll also be more prone to obesity because you're not breaking down as many nutrients to ATP for your cells to use. The opposite of that would be hyperthyroidism, where they would be typically hotter because their metabolism is running really fast. And they would have extreme weight loss because they would be burning a lot of their body's energy by having a higher basal metabolic rate. Now, thyroid hormone is also necessary for the development of most of your body's tissues, especially your nervous system. So, for instance, if your thyroid hormone levels are low in utero or while you're developing as a fetus, then that can lead to a lot of congenital defects because thyroid hormone is necessary for proper fetal development, especially development of the nervous system. Now, thyroid hormone levels are regulated by a negative feedback mechanism. And what we find here is that when thyroid hormone levels get high enough, thyroid hormone can travel back through the bloodstream to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, whereby thyroid hormone itself can inhibit the hypothalamus from releasing TRH and the anterior pituitary from releasing TSH. What this allows is it kind of defines an upper limit of thyroid hormone levels. So if TRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to release TSH, and TSH stimulates the thyroid to release TH, well, we don't want thyroid hormone levels to get too high, so eventually, when high enough, this thyroid hormone will inhibit the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary from releasing their thyroid-related hormones, which eventually decreases the amount of thyroid hormone released by your thyroid gland, and therefore lowering or at least stabilizing thyroid hormone levels in your body. Because you can imagine if thyroid hormone levels got too high, that can lead to a lot of problems. Like too high of a basal metabolic rate could increase your body temperature to like fatal levels. So you don't want your thyroid hormone levels to get too high. There are some people who abuse thyroid hormone drugs like thyroxine as a weight loss mechanism because they can increase their metabolism to lose weight. But it's dangerous because if you overdose on thyroid hormone levels, or thyroid hormone, that can lead to some pretty damaging effects in the body. Now, remember, within the thyroid gland, we have the parafollicular cells. These are larger endocrine cells located between each of the thyroid follicles. And what these parafollicular cells do is they secrete a hormone called calcitonin. What calcitonin does is it decreases blood calcium by increasing the reabsorption or the deposition of calcium into your body's bones. So calcitonin stimulates osteoblast activity. Osteoblasts will take calcium out of your bloodstream, put it into your bones, thereby lowering your blood calcium levels. That's the role of calcitonin here. So it reduces blood calcium by encouraging bone growth or bone deposition. So if somebody had a disease where they had too much calcitonin, they might end up with a disorder where they have low calcium levels like hypocalcemia and possibly malformed bones because there's so much calcium being deposited in their bones. So what this slide just summarizes are some of the different hormones released by the thyroid gland. We have thyroid hormone and calcitonin. Remember, thyroid hormone is involved with regulating basal metabolic rate, so metabolism of most of your body cells as well as their oxygen utilization or use. And it also supports development of tissues early on. And so what happens is if someone has hypothyroidism prenatally, they can end up with something called cretinism, where their nervous system just doesn't form properly and most of their body's tissues are just underdeveloped to the point where they're severely mentally retarded and probably couldn't function on their own. Now, calcitonin comes from those parafollicular cells in the thyroid, and what calcitonin does is it actually increases osteoblast activity and removes calcium from your bloodstream and basically deposits it into your bone to lower your blood calcium levels. Now, one more hormone that's talked about here, but it's not part of your thyroid gland, is called parathyroid hormone. Now, parathyroid hormone is secreted by your parathyroid glands, which are located on the posterior aspect of your thyroid gland. There's like 4 to 6 little bumps back behind your thyroid gland. And those are called the parathyroid glands. Now, what these parathyroid glands do is they release parathyroid hormone. What parathyroid hormone does is it increases blood calcium levels. So if your blood calcium levels get too low, parathyroid hormone causes your blood calcium levels to rise. So this parathyroid hormone secreted by your parathyroid glands, it's secreted by the chief cells. And so what the parathyroid glands look like is on the back of the thyroid gland, which we can see here. So the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, we find these little bumps here. These are called the parathyroid glands. They're not technically part of the thyroid, but they're attached to the thyroid. It's a different type of tissue that has different cells that release different hormones. Now these chief cells here release parathyroid hormone, and once that hormone makes it into the bloodstream, parathyroid hormone exerts basically 3 main effects that all act to increase blood calcium. So if your blood calcium levels are low, your parathyroid glands will release parathyroid hormone. That gets pumped throughout your bloodstream, and the 3 main effects that parathyroid hormone has to increase blood calcium levels is, for one, it increases osteoclast activity in your bones. Remember, osteoclasts were the types of cells that break down bony matrix. And if parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclast activity in your bones, basically you're increasing bone resorption or breakdown and thereby liberating calcium into your bloodstream. So it's going to increase your blood calcium levels. So this is kind of odd. Remember in AMP1 we talked about how your bones function as a reservoir of calcium. Well, when your blood calcium levels are low, parathyroid hormone can stimulate osteoclasts to basically break down bone and liberate some of that calcium back into the bloodstream to get your blood calcium levels back up. But parathyroid hormone also increases calcium reabsorption in the kidneys. That way you don't lose as much calcium into your urine. But it also increases calcium absorption in the gut too. Because parathyroid hormone acts on vitamin D in different ways, like it actually increases the synthesis of calcitriol by the kidneys, ultimately parathyroid hormone can increase the amount of calcium that your gut absorbs in your food. So if you have low calcium levels in your blood, parathyroid hormone can allow you to absorb more calcium from your food into your bloodstream, thereby increasing your blood calcium levels. To a point though, okay? Because this is negative feedback. So if this were a positive feedback mechanism, what would happen is parathyroid hormone levels would basically continually increase calcium levels in your blood, beyond homeostatic levels, and that's not a normal mechanism. Normally what happens is that you're only going to release parathyroid hormone if your blood calcium levels are low. Once you get to a normal homeostatic set point or range, parathyroid will stop being released. That way your blood calcium levels can plateau and not continue to spike. That's what's going to keep your blood calcium levels from increasing too much, is a negative feedback mechanism. So what happens is there's something called humoral stimulus, where your parathyroid glands can sense blood calcium. So if blood calcium is too low, they'll release parathyroid hormone, which increases blood calcium. If blood calcium levels are too high, your parathyroid glands will not release parathyroid hormone. And therefore, they won't help to increase your blood calcium, and eventually your blood calcium can get to like a homeostatic level, like a normal level. Okay? So if you think about a disease that would affect the parathyroid glands, like let's say if you had a secreting tumor of parathyroid hormone. In fact, what's odd is a lot of lung tumors can do this. So lung tumors, for whatever reason, can commonly secrete parathyroid hormone because the tumor cells can take on that phenotype. They can start to make parathyroid hormone. So sometimes hyperparathyroidism could be a sign of cancer. But if someone has hyperparathyroidism from like a secreting tumor, then they're going to have abnormally elevated blood calcium. Also brittle bones, because their bones are going to be broken down by that parathyroid hormone stimulating osteoclasts in their bones. Now, what we're going to do next is basically move on to the adrenal glands, which are basically these paired glands that sit atop the kidneys. Now, the adrenal glands are also called the suprarenal glands because they sit above the kidneys. They're not technically part of the kidney, but we usually talk about it as being nearby into the kidney because they do sit right on top. Now, they're made of glandular tissue, and basically the adrenal glands' purpose is to make and secrete hormones. Now, the adrenal glands can be broken down into two main layers. We have an adrenal cortex and an adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex is the outermost layer that within that actually has three more layers we'll talk about. And the adrenal medulla is an inner layer that's actually made of neural tissue. So the adrenal cortex is made of glandular tissue. The adrenal medulla is made of neural type tissue. And they sit right above each kidney here. And what we're looking at is basically the cortex, so the outermost layer. But if we cut into each adrenal gland, we'd find there's an inner layer called the medulla. Again, this is what the adrenal glands would look like on a cadaver. They're these kind of smaller pyramidal-shaped glands that are also highly vascular because they release a lot of important hormones. Now, if we zoom in on a cross-section of the adrenal gland, what we find is there's two main layers. We get the cortex, which is this outer part, and we have a medulla, which is this inner part. So remember, cortex means bark, medulla means marrow. And so the cortex, if we zoom in on that, has three additional layers here. We got zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Whereas the adrenal medulla only has one basically layer or cell type, and that's just the medulla itself. Now, each type of cell in each layer secretes a certain type of hormone. So cells of the zona glomerulosa secrete a class of hormones which we call the mineralocorticoids. Okay? Cells in the zona fasciculata secrete a class of hormones we call the glucocorticoids. And cells in the zona reticularis secrete a class of hormones we call the androcorticoids. Now, they're also called corticoids because they're all hormones that are released by the adrenal cortex, but they're all steroid hormones. Remember, steroid hormones are lipid-soluble. They can travel into your cells and change gene expression of your body cells, and they're also derived from cholesterol. So it's important that somebody has normal cholesterol levels in their blood because cholesterol is an important precursor to steroid hormones. If someone is on like some sort of extreme diet and their cholesterol levels are extremely low, they might have steroid hormone insufficiency as a result because they might not have enough cholesterol to make steroid hormones. Now the adrenal medulla here is full of a specialized type of cell called chromaffin cells that make and secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are part of the sympathetic nervous system. Now we can see what those layers would look like here under a histology slide. So this is under a light microscope. We have the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Or if you think about it like this, we have GFR. So GFR, from superficial to deep. Glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. Now, the adrenal cortex is made of more of like glandular tissue. Adrenal medulla is made of neural tissue. And they create and secrete different classes of hormones. So the adrenal cortex is the outermost part of the gland. It's stimulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and it releases basically corticosteroids, like the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, and the androcorticoids. I'm sorry, the gonadocorticoids. Now, the adrenal medulla makes and secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are sympathetic hormones that have a fight or flight effect on your body's tissues. So remember, we had the zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. It turns out the mineralocorticoids are the ones that are made by zona glomerulosa, and the main mineralocorticoid is called aldosterone. And what aldosterone does is it regulates sodium and potassium levels in your bloodstream. And so this is an extremely important hormone for sodium and potassium in your bloodstream that's made by your adrenal cortex, specifically in the zona glomerulosa, and it comes from a class of hormones called the mineralocorticoids. Now, the glucocorticoids are a class of what we call stress hormones. These glucocorticoids are primarily released during the stress response, whether it's physical or emotional stress. The main type of glucocorticoid is basically cortisol, or also, you guys might know it as corticosterone. But what cortisol does is it alters your body's metabolism. Okay, so it basically increases blood sugar and fatty acid levels in your bloodstream. Now, the last class of the corticosteroids is the gonadocorticoids, which are basically sex hormones, so that you don't only get sex hormones from the gonads, you can also get sex hormones from the adrenal cortex, specifically these gonadocorticoids. And we'll come back to this. Now remember, zona glomerulosa produces the mineralocorticoids, fasciculata makes the glucocorticoids, and reticularis makes the gonadocorticoids. Now these are numbered from superficial to deep. So if someone has damage to their adrenal gland, let's say if it's like external damage, like a bruise or something, it's most likely to affect zona glomerulosa first, because that's the most superficial layer here, and that's going to affect the mineralocorticoids, which include things like aldosterone. Now, I'll just briefly mention that aldosterone is involved with sodium and potassium levels in your blood. Now, it does this through regulating how the kidneys either secrete potassium or hold on to sodium. So what aldosterone does is, when aldosterone is present, aldosterone stimulates the kidneys to retain sodium but remove potassium. So if your aldosterone levels are high, you're going to retain more sodium in your kidneys, and so retain more sodium in your bloodstream, but you're going to lose more potassium in your urine. Okay? You might wonder when that's important. Well, it can be important if you have high potassium levels or if you have low sodium levels. So both of those will stimulate aldosterone release. Because if your sodium levels are low, your adrenal cortex can release aldosterone, which causes your kidneys to hold on to sodium so you don't lose it in urine. Or if your blood potassium levels are high, aldosterone can allow your kidneys to secrete that potassium and eliminate it from your body. Now, zona fasciculata makes the glucocorticoids like corticosterone, which is cortisol. It's a stress hormone that alters your metabolism. It's going to increase the breakdown of fatty acid stores. It has anti-insulin effects, so it's going to increase your blood sugar levels. And if you think about it from the standpoint of stress, it would make sense how you'd want to have nutrient levels higher in your bloodstream if your body's stressed, because typically if you're undergoing stress, you're probably going to be more sympathetically active, and you're going to need to have more nutrients available for your body's tissues that need them. Now, zona reticularis makes the gonadocorticoids, which mainly include androgens, which are a form of male sex hormones, and those can be converted to things like estrogen. So the gonadocorticoids are a source of estrogen in post-menopausal women. So after menopause, even though the ovaries stop secreting estrogen, you can still get estrogen from zona reticularis from the adrenal cortex. So what this slide summarizes is basically just each of those hormones we talked about. Remember, the mineralocorticoids include aldosterone, glucocorticoids include cortisol, gonadocorticoids are in androgens, and we have epinephrine and norepinephrine are released by chromaffin cells of your adrenal medulla. So remember, mineralocorticoids mostly include aldosterone, and if you have normal aldosterone secretion, it regulates the concentrations of sodium and potassium in your bloodstream. Okay, so it allows you to retain sodium and lose potassium through your urine. Now, glucocorticoids like cortisol stimulate lipid and protein metabolism, so you have higher lipids and higher protein and higher blood sugar as a result. The gonadocorticoids basically are just another source of sex hormones. So this is going to stimulate the production of protein by your sex cells, as well as other secondary sex characteristics like body hair, breast growth, gonad growth, that kind of stuff. And then epinephrine and norepinephrine basically just have sympathetic effects that we talked about in AAP1. Now, where you would find low levels or excessive levels with either of these hormones are in certain diseases. So we talked about how with Addison's disease, we can have low levels of adrenal cortex hormones, And that can lead to a variety of effects. So, for instance, if due to Addison's disease you had low mineralocorticoids, what that would mean then is that you'd have trouble secreting potassium and holding on to sodium. So that can affect the electrolyte imbalance in your body, and that can lead to disturbances of action potentials and muscle contraction, that kind of stuff. With Addison's disease, you can also get low levels of cortisol, which would mean you might have low nutrient levels in your blood. You can have low blood glucose, low lipids, and low protein in your bloodstream as a result. Now, if you have hypersecretion of aldosterone, this causes hypertension and edema. The reason why it causes high blood pressure and edema is, remember, aldosterone allows you to hold on or retain sodium. Now, if you're holding on to sodium, it turns out that water follows sodium. So if you're secreting a hormone in excess, which is aldosterone, that allows you to retain sodium, you're also going to retain a lot of water, which is going to increase your blood pressure and also cause your tissues to swell, causing edema. So hyperaldosteronism could lead to high blood pressure and widespread edema throughout the body. Now, high levels of glucocorticoids like cortisol can cause something called Cushing's syndrome, which is like a kind of a metabolic disorder that affects basically the growth of certain tissues like adipose tissue. So in Cushing's syndrome, you can start to see a lot of adipose growing on the dorsal surface of the superior back here, where they get something called buffalo hump. There's a large sort of deposition of adipose right here. It also causes the overgrowth of adipose in the face. You get a lot of more adiposity in the cheeks, so their faces look more round. And it also causes an overgrowth of blood vessels and vasodilation in the face, so their face looks more red too. That's called Cushing's syndrome, but we'll come back to this in pathophysiology. Now, if you have low levels of the gonadotropins, it usually doesn't have any effect because you can still get sex hormones from your gonads. But if you have high levels of these gonadotropins, that can cause this androgenital syndrome, where you can have excessive sort of secondary sex characteristics as a result. Now, a pheochromocytoma is actually a secreting tumor of the adrenal medulla, where you get excessive amounts of epinephrine and norepinephrine being released, so you get like an excessive sympathetic response. So somebody with a pheochromocytoma would have, an abnormally fast heart rate, high blood pressure, decreased digestive activity, digestive motility, decreased urine output. All of these sympathetic effects would be exaggerated due to this secreting tumor of the adrenal medulla. Now, the adrenal medulla has your chromaffin cells. Those secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine. Again, those just exert a sympathetic effect.